Once again, this is Ken Jobst from St. Stephen Church in Louisville, Kentucky, and I am so pleased to be with you as together we get busy pursuing gold. We're continuing our Men's Month study of the 4 kings that we are lifting out of the book of 2 Chronicles in the Bible. You'll recall that the kingdom of Judah had 20 kings. But only 8 of those kings were designated as good kings that followed in the way of the Lord. Today we want to take a look at King Hezekiah, one of the best of the good kings. Hezekiah was truly one of the great kings of Judah. The Bible dedicates 10 chapters in 3 different books to his life and his reign. We hear about him in 2 Chronicles, chapters 29 through 32, 2 Kings, chapters 18 through 20, and Isaiah, chapter 37 through 39. So you can take a look at those at your leisure. You know what? Another thing that's important for us to understand is the context of Hezekiah's reign. Hezekiah became king of Judah at about the time that the northern kingdom of Israel was being carried away captive by the Assyrians. So the question then, and remember, that's not very far away from Judah. That's like a next door neighbor getting conquered. And so the question naturally would be, what's going to become of Judah? If Israel was defeated and carried away by the Assyrian army, what hope could there be for Judah? What's going to be in store? Would they be able to repent before they found themselves defeated? So I want to lift up just a couple of verses from 2 Chronicles chapter 29, the opening few verses. Hezekiah became king when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. Then he brought in the priests and the Levites, gathered them in the east square, and said to them, "Hear me, Levites, now sanctify yourselves, sanctify the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the rubbish from the holy place." Now, I love that. I love that. Hezekiah is clearly one of the most outstanding of the Judean kings. And 2 Chronicles chapter 29 leads us in the steps, these important steps that Hezekiah took to reestablish temple worship. First of all, we see that Hezekiah empowered faithful leaders. He called the Levites to him. He called in the priests. So he empowers these faithful leaders, and then, I love this, he assigns them to clean out the trash. And it appears as though at this time in Judah's history, the temple had become kind of a catch-all space where different stuff was stored over there and different stuff was stored over here, and old vacation Bible school materials and stuff from plays from 30 years ago, and that the temple was just chock full of junk that nobody needed anymore. Junk that might have served a purpose decades ago but was no longer, relevant. So Hezekiah had him clear out the junk, clear out the old trash, right? Very important. Then upon having cleared out all the old trash and stuff, he offers sacrifices of atonement on behalf of the sanctuary and the nation. And Hezekiah reestablishes worship, and he restructures the institution of the temple. So, and you've heard Pastor Cosby talk about this, and he's absolutely right, that it's the institutions that anchor a community. And so Hezekiah gets busy as an institution builder. They reinstitute the celebration of the Passover. They establish a mechanism of contributions to support the priesthood. And you'll notice that this is great. In chapter 30, they reestablish these offerings to be gathered on behalf of the Levites and on behalf of the temple service. And in verse 10 of chapter 30, we find that they had gathered enough and plenty to spare. Enough for the service of the temple and plenty to spare. The language that's used to describe that is very, very reminiscent of the language that Jesus uses in the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Remember, in each case, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, people were fed enough, and there was yet more to spare. They gathered up the 12 hand baskets of leftovers. They gathered up the 7 laundry baskets worth of leftovers in the feeding of the 4,000. So that's a biblical echo there, that when the Spirit of God is moving, that there is enough and there is plenty to spare. So there are the contributions that Hezekiah organizes, but in addition to the contributions, there are distributions that Hezekiah organizes. Distributions to the priesthood, right? Old and young in the priesthood. And this is very important. Hezekiah establishes distributions to the very young, to like 3-year-olds that were among the Levites. You could be a Levite and be 3 years old because you're in that Levitical tribe of Levites. But Hezekiah invested in the next generation by making sure there was a distribution that went even to 3-year-old Levites. Right? So 2 Chronicles says, this is what Hezekiah did throughout Judah, doing what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God. So that's the good works that Hezekiah did. Now, we shift gears in Hezekiah's story, and there comes to be a national crisis of desperate proportions. And we've hinted to that already, that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, right, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to Assyria. And now here comes Sennacherib, and he's on a roll. He's got the momentum. And he comes to Jerusalem to conquer Judea and Jerusalem itself. So, after all that Hezekiah had so faithfully done, says 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 1, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah. 2 Chronicles 32, verses 20 through 22 reads like this. King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, cried out in prayer to heaven about this. And the Lord sent an angel who annihilated all the fighting men and the commanders and officers in the camp of the Assyrian king. So he withdrew to his own land in disgrace. And when he went into the temple of his God, some of his sons, his own flesh and blood, cut him down with a sword. So the Lord saved Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and from the hand of all others, he took care of them on every side. So this is the episode where the Lord sends one angel who annihilates 185,000 Assyrian troops. You can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 35. And thereby preserving Judah as a nation, right? So Hezekiah comes in. He's doing what's right in the eyes of the Lord, reestablishing temple worship, so on and so forth. This crisis comes, and it turns out that, hey, this is an existential crisis. I mean, the Assyrians were no joke. They came to conquer. And Hezekiah and Isaiah, they go out, they pray, God sends an angel and defeats the Assyrian troops. Now, that's some big stuff right there. But now, watch this. After all that, something happens to Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verses 24 through 26. In those days, Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. He prayed to the Lord, who answered him and gave him a miraculous sign. But Hezekiah's heart was proud, and he did not respond to the kindness shown to him. Therefore the Lord's wrath was on him and on Judah and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah repented of the pride of his heart, as did the people of Jerusalem. Therefore the Lord's wrath did not come on them during the days of Hezekiah. By the way, what we're going to talk about here is bitterness. And the character flaw that's going to come up in Hezekiah's life is the character flaw of bitterness. Listen from Isaiah chapter 38. In those days, Hezekiah was sick and near death. Watch. Isaiah is telling the same story that 2 Chronicles is telling. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, went to him and said to him, Thus saith the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord and said, Remember now, O Lord, I pray, how I have walked before you in truth and with a loyal heart, and have done what is good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. This is the writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, when he had been sick and recovered from his sickness. I said, In the prime of my life shall I go to the gates of Sheol. I am deprived of the remainder of my years. I said, I shall not see Yah, the Lord, in the land of the living. I shall observe man no more among the inhabitants of the world. My lifespan is gone, taken from me like a shepherd's tent. I have cut off my life like a weaver. He cuts me off from the loom. From day until night you make an end of me. I've considered until morning. Like a lion he breaks my bones. From day until night you make an end of me. Wow. That's strong stuff. That's coming from Isaiah chapter 39. Now look, watch. Hezekiah was only 39 years old when he got the news from Isaiah that he should get his affairs in order because he was fixing to die. He did not take this news particularly well. As a matter of fact, 2 Chronicles says that Hezekiah's heart was proud and he didn't respond to the kindness that was shown to him. But we know that he ultimately repented, right? What I want to do here is just talk about for a moment that spiritual poison of bitterness. So bitterness is defined as an anger and a disappointment at being treated unfairly. It's a synonym for resentment. So, by the way, have you ever noticed bitterness is a characteristic of poisons? Poisons seem to be invariably bitter. And watch, it works the other way. Bitterness is invariably poison. The Bible warns us against the danger of the poison of bitterness. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15 says, Look carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up, causing trouble. And by this many have become defiled. Now watch. What's it say? It says that Hezekiah turned his face to the wall, he prayed, and he wept bitterly. He prayed, and he wept bitterly. So he had this bitterness of spirit, but even in and through that bitterness of spirit, he still prayed. And God answered his prayer. And God gave him 15 more years of life. Good for Hezekiah. Not so good for the nation of Judah. Hear me out. In those 15 years, in that time that God gave Hezekiah, in those remaining 15 years, Babylonian envoys came to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah showed them all of his riches, showed him his palace, showed him all this great stuff. The Babylonian envoys said, hey, we came because you were sick and you got better. Hezekiah never tells the Babylonians that it was God who made him better. Never shows the Babylonians the temple. Never introduces them to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And watch. Many years later, everything that Hezekiah showed the Babylonians gets carried away into the Babylonian exile. So, mercy. There was some problem for Judah because of those additional 15 years. You know what else? Another problem for Judah because of the additional 15 years? During that time, Hezekiah had a son named Manasseh. And Manasseh would turn out to be evil in the eyes of the Lord, reverse many of the reforms that Hezekiah put into place, and would lead Judah for 55 years, longer than any other king in Judah. So that certainly that 15 years, that's good for Hezekiah, but it was not good for the nation. The nation's going to be carried away captive. They're going to lose all of the treasure to Babylon. And Hezekiah's son Manasseh, excuse me, evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, some questions for our reflection and for discussion. Excuse me. Hezekiah clearly started out strong. He had an agenda of bringing the nation back to God. What happened? What was it that got in his way? What's more important? The way you start or the way you finish, right? What's more important? Now, second question, how was Hezekiah prepared for the challenge of Sennacherib? When the leader of the Assyrians came with his army, how was Hezekiah prepared? How did Sennacherib surprise Hezekiah? Did God surprise Sennacherib with that angel? Right? And let me ask this question. Did Hezekiah fumble the ball at that point? Did God bring a blessing to Hezekiah and the nation of Judah, and did they fumble that somehow? A third question. Bitterness can be difficult to overcome. How do you protect yourself, like the book of Hebrews tells us? How do you protect yourself from spiritual bitterness? Because bitterness is the acid that etches its container, right? So if you're carrying bitterness, it's like swallowing poison and expecting somebody else to die. All right. Now, but by the way, what pressure do you feel like Hezekiah felt? Now Hezekiah certainly would have felt military pressure from Sennacherib, would have felt political pressure, would have felt spiritual pressure. How do you feel Hezekiah might have better responded to those pressures in his life? Now, once again, I want to raise this notion as another question. As you read this account in 2 Chronicles, toward the end of the account in chapter 33, you'll see that the consequences of Hezekiah's bitterness did not so much fall on him as they fell upon the nation. And once again, I'm thinking here of the reign of Manasseh and ultimately the Babylonian captivity. Are we always aware of the collateral damage that attends our own bitterness? You know, if I'm bitter, what collateral damage goes along with that? Who else suffers? Family, children, co-workers, church. Who else suffers when we allow ourselves the luxury of being bitter? So this is a consideration of the life of one of the outstanding kings of Judah. He was one of the good kings of Judah, but even yet and still, though he started strong, though he walked in the way of the Lord, he did not finish well. And he didn't finish well because of harboring bitterness. Well, tell you what, I'm going to get out of the way right now. I'd like for you guys to go ahead and consider, reflect, discuss these questions and this king among the four kings and how his character shaped his leadership. Until next time, this is Ken Jobst from the St. Stephen Church in Louisville, Kentucky with the Pursuing Gold class. God bless you. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.